Hello, this is Cloud Chartist with a top-down multi-time frame analysis on IBM. I'm going to be going over some uh, thoughts on a question that many people have about which time frames they should be trading. So I'll go over the analysis and try to inject my thoughts on that subject as I go. So we're looking at IBM here on the weekly time frame. You can see down here I didn't bother to remove all of the earnings announcement symbols from that Thinkorswim marks there. You see that there's this one that doesn't have any money attached to it because we have the earnings coming up on 19th of January. So that's about 2 weeks from, well, let's see, 10 days from now. So whenever there's an earnings announcement, there is a risk that there could be a large move in either direction. So currently, IBM is bullish on the weekly time frame. You can see it has made a very nice inverse head and shoulders pattern here. It's not perhaps I should not say very nice because it's not really clear where the neckline would be drawn, but it is a nice example of a inverse head and shoulders type bottoming pattern. So you can see this blue rectangle here is where I have marked this gap from the prior earnings in 2013. We had a very big gap down here, and that gap has yet to be filled. We have not tested back to the top of the gap area, which is at, let's see, 182.05 is the top of that gap area, and that is where that gap will be filled. So I'm going to zoom in. We can examine the weekly action right now. So you see that we do have a nice uptrend here. Today's candle, or sorry, this week's candle so far is this red candle that has been forming here. So far it's within last week's candle, so the trend is still up. If we do get a close below the close of last week's candle, we could get a trend change to the downside. I think actually, let's see, this candle put in a high of 169.80. 160. Sorry, I was like pointing at the candle. The high was 169.80. Last week's high was 169.92. So we are actually inside last week's candle thus far. So therefore, unless we go above last week's candle, there's still a possibility for a trend change to the downside if we do put in a lower high and a lower low. If we do continue to sell this week, then we do have the possibility of coming down and testing the Tenkan-sen, which is currently located at 163.75, which I would consider to be a very nice buy point. Because as long as price is over the Tenkan-sen, there's no reason to suggest that the trend change might be other than just a temporary pullback. If we do put in a weekly close below the Tenkan-sen, then we need to start worrying about the weekly trend, but we are still significantly above the cloud, and everything else is bullish in Ichimoku terms on this particular chart. We do have a rising thick cloud moving into March and later on in the year. We do have some flat sideways cloud action going on from, say, April through June, and then, or sorry, April through late May, and then we do have a nice rising cloud. The cloud is very thick and very supportive, so as long as price action stays above the cloud, it's bullish in Ichimoku terms. That's the weekly. So bullish in all ways Ichimoku on the weekly time frame. Looking at the and one note about trading this. So if you are interested in putting a trade on in IBM, and say you're interested in buying it on the weekly time frame, you need to determine what your account size is going to let you risk. On the weekly time frame, I wouldn't want to enter a trade unless I was willing to risk that we could trade down to the Tenkan Sen. So that's 163.75. That's about $4 lower. So depending on your account size and position size, if you want to take a trade on IBM on the weekly time frame and you wanted to enter it around here, then you need to be willing to risk about $4. If if we do start testing the Tenkan Sen and put in a weekly close below the Tenkan Sen, it might be a good idea to consider getting out of the trade. Although, of course, it once again depends on your risk parameters. All right. So also, since we do have this this rectangle, which is marking that gap, which happens to be called a window in Ichimoku terms. Gaps are called windows. This is a window. We could actually find support at the bottom of the window. So the bottom of the window here is at 166.89. So we could come down and test support at 166.89 and hold that level. You can see that that level was prior resistance before last week's breakout above it. Therefore, prior resistance could become support. All right, let's go down to the daily time frame. The daily time frame, IBM came down and put in a close just slightly below the Tenkan Sen. The Tenkan Sen is moving sideways, it's flat. The Kijun Sen is also moving sideways and is also flat. In Ichimoku, price action is attracted to flats. Flats represent equilibrium. So this chart was saying that price action was getting a little bit extended above the indicators and needed a little bit of reversion back towards them. That's why these went flat. So it's important to see that we continue to trade above the Tenkan Sen. If we do trade lower, there's some other obvious horizontal levels that we could perhaps test. The fact that we put in a close just slightly under the Tenkan Sen does suggest that it's possible that we could enter a trading range between the Tenkan Sen and the Kijun Sen. So basically, if we start moving lower, and we don't hold this previous area of support around 166, 165.90s, something like that, we could come down and test the Kijun Sen. Also, if we did that, things would still be quite bullish for IBM, as we are still above a nice rising healthy cloud. We do have some obvious topping tails. We tried to test up into the 170 region and thus far have been rejected on multiple occasions. The high was 169.95 and we got rejected hard, and have not been able to get back up to the level. In the most recent last 4 days, we once again tried to test 170 and have not been able. So that's a clear resistance area, as this 170 area is been causing some problems thus far for IBM. So if you were to get long around this level, around the 167.65 level, you want to see what's happening when we get up to 170 and see if we get rejected from there again, or whether we can break higher and start moving higher into the gap. That's just the scale of the gap area on this time frame, just trying to show you. So let's move down to some shorter time frames and see what they tell us about the overall trend on IBM. So basically, the shorter the time frame, it's sort of like it's late at night. I'm not feeling particularly articulate, but when price action decides to start changing trend, it's going to do so on the shorter time frames. So the shorter time frames are going to indicate when there's a possibility that the longer time frame trends might change. That said, one needs to pay attention to the time frame that one is interested in trading on, more so than the shorter time frames, because one can be jerked around by the shorter time frames that may not be relevant to the trade that you're entering on. So if you want to take a swing trade off the daily time frame, you're going to want to hold that for days. So if you see price action doing all sorts of crazy interesting stuff on shorter time frames, it might just be messing around on those shorter time frames, but that messing around might not affect the overall trend on the time frame that you are looking at. It's oftentimes if you're in a winning trade and you note that the trade starts to go against you on a shorter time frame, you might be getting out of a trade that could be continuing to work on a longer time frame, based on a shorter time frame movement that ends up not being really relevant to the larger time frame at hand. I have no idea if that made sense. Let's look at the 4-hour. Looking at the 4-hour for more clues on IBM, we see that we did actually, after holding, let me zoom in a little bit more. After holding the Tenkan-sen on a closing basis for several 4-hour candles, we note that the second to last 4-hour, or the third to last, because this one is just tiny one just started forming, but at the end of the trading session today. But this last couple of 4-hour candles lost the Tenkan-sen here. Tried to hold the Tenkan-sen. We do have a big significant bottoming candle here, but we did fail to hold the Tenkan-sen on the 4-hour time frame. And then we opened under the Tenkan-sen, and then were unable to get back over it and continued to sell. And in fact, we even lost the Kijun-sen. This chart is still bullish in Ichimoku terms, as we are still over the cloud. So if you entered the trade on the daily time frame, and you see that we are starting to lose support on the 4-hour time frame, you might be worried about getting out of the trade, but it's still bullish in Ichimoku terms because it's still over the cloud on the 4-hour time frame. We do have an area where price could trade through. The cloud is very thin here on the 4-hour time frame. So if we do get more selling pressure, and we do come down and test the cloud down here around 166.80, 166.82, this would be an area that we could indeed lose the support of the cloud. That's going to happen in the next 4-hour candle. If we do not lose this area of support, you'll notice that the cloud becomes thicker and rising into the next few days, the rest of the week. We have a thicker rising cloud. So as long as we hold this thicker rising cloud on the 4-hour time frame, then the trend is still bullish in Ichimoku terms. In fact, into next week, we also have a higher rising cloud. So if you are long IBM, you want to see it remain above this cloud. And if it's above this cloud on the 4-hour time frame, its trend is still going to be intact on the daily time frame. Let's go down to a shorter time frame. Let's look at the hourly. On the hourly time frame, you see that we lost the Tenkan-sen here, put in a close under the Tenkan-sen. Then we continued lower and put in a close under the Kijun-sen. We tried to get a little bounce. We do see several bottoming tails in this area, but we were unable to get back above the Kijun-sen. And this candle here actually lost the support of the cloud and came down, sort of support of the top of the cloud, came down and traded inside the cloud. This candle here traded slightly below the cloud and then put in a close inside the cloud. And these last two hourly candles are actually traded under the cloud. Now, IBM is a, I don't know how to say this, but it's expensive enough stock that it can make rather large moves just based on liquidity. So, we could be trading at within this range just based on not that many trades going through. I don't know if that made sense, but so anyway, but regardless, we are currently trading under the cloud on the hourly time frame. So we are in fact bearish on the hourly time frame. The trend is bearish. So that is something to keep an eye on if you're trading this time frame. We also have some sort of a double top type action. Any pattern that looks sort of like an M. This looks sort of like a really big shoulder, a little head, and a really big shoulder. This is not a particularly bullish pattern that you want to see, but it could be just part of a larger consolidation type pattern, trading in a range, between 167 and 169, moving sideways. In fact, if we pan out a little bit, we have a sort of choppy uptrend and then just some sideways in a range type action. You could sort of mark that range like this so far, let's go down to a shorter time frame. Let's go down to the 30-minute time frame. So in the 30-minute time frame, we are solidly under the cloud here, and so therefore we are bearish on the 30-minute time frame. If we go down to the 15-minute time frame, you'll see that we are indeed bearish on the 15-minute time frame as well. But we are oversold on the 15-minute time frame. When we get to oversold, there's usually a good chance for a bounce. You can see that when we were previously oversold, we did get a nice bounce, and which began this nice trend to the upside. You see also that we became overbought on the 15-minute time frame on a couple of different occasions and got a bit of a correction. We were overbought yesterday, or sorry, today actually. It's slightly after midnight here on Tuesday. So today, earlier, we were overbought and got this correction lower. So basically, all of this correction lower could be just working off the overbought conditions to the point of being oversold. I don't know if that made sense. So what we're looking for if we do want to catch a bounce is for the Tenkan-sen to flatten out, and it it trended down here, then it did flatten out, and we did get a mean reversion bounce back towards it. Then we got the Tenkan-sen trending down again, and price trended down as well. The Tenkan-sen went flat, suggesting a potential for a bounce, and we did get a bounce up through the Tenkan-sen that did not manage to remain above the Tenkan-sen and put a close down below the Tenkan-sen, and so we had the Tenkan-sen pointing down again, and now we have the Tenkan-sen perhaps leveling out, asking for another potential mean reversion bounce back towards it at 167.96. So if you are trading IBM on the 15-minute time frame, which you can't because it's the middle of the night, it's not really trading, at least not for regular people. Of course, there are people that have access to the overnight markets and that have access to trading in black pools and things like this that regular people like myself do not have access to. But so we'll see what happens in the overnight session and tomorrow, whether or not we can get a mean reversion bounce back towards 167.96, and whether or not we can get over that and perhaps get back trending upwards for IBM. So if you are trading on the shorter time frames, you would be entering a trade based on the signals that the Ichimoku chart is giving you, and this trade right now would have been a short ever since we put in a close underneath the cloud and underneath the Tenkan-sen here, and that short trade has not been invalidated yet with a close back above the Tenkan-sen. So if you are short IBM here, you can stay short until we trade once again above the Tenkan-sen, or perhaps when we retest the Tenkan-sen, you might consider covering your short trade. But really, we want to see a close above the Tenkan-sen in order to invalidate the 15-minute time frame sell signal. Anyway, I hope that made some sense, and thank you for watching, and have a good night, and we will see you tomorrow.